If you thought making routine decisions are difficult, wait till you face an ethical dilemma. Let's explore. We all make decisions throughout the day. Most are personal, some are professional, some deal with relationships. Oh, sometimes we have to make decisions that challenges us ethically. And in today's session, I will talk about these decisions. That is ethical decision making. That is how to make sound ethical decisions. In today's session, very briefly, I'll outline the meaning of ethical decision, situations that demands ethical decision-making skills, and lastly, I'll also talk about 8 stages of making ethical decisions. Stay tuned till the end because towards the end, I'll talk about how to write an answer for a previous year's question. Let me start with a situation here. Imagine Ashok, a senior civil servant, one day gets evidence of his boss passing on confidential tender information to a government contractor. And it's hard proof against his boss. And the moment Ashok sees that, he has this big ethical issue that confronts him. Should he take on his boss and escalate the conflict at the risk of his career? Or should he keep quiet and let his career prosper? What should he do? Now, this is not exactly a routine decision that Ashok has to take. As Ashok sits and keeps thinking about the decision, the weight of ethical decision making becomes very clear. Why the weight is heavy here is because there are no procedures to guide you. There are no rules to guide you. And the risk is huge. Now, Ashok has to take a call. Is he willing to sacrifice his career and escalate the conflict? So he starts weighing options. So that's the problem with ethical decision making. You have two difficult options to choose from, and both are equally justified. Before I start explaining what does ethical decision making mean and the stages of ethical decision making, let me first elaborate the two key words here. The two key words here are ethical and decision. When I say ethical, the term refers to actions, decisions, or judgments that have moral content and are grounded in values, principles, or moral rules. Ethical is all about discerning what is right and wrong, good and bad. When I use the word decision, it refers to a specific commitment to action, and the key word here is commitment to action. It's the point where deliberation turns into concrete steps. Now let's combine both the words ethical and decision, and let's understand what does the word ethical decision mean. Ethical decisions are decisions or commitment to action where moral values are in question or moral principles are in question. In fact, though, when I say ethical decision, these are decisions which has moral content in it. It's loaded with moral values. When we say ethical decision making, it refers to the process of making decisions based on ethical values or ethical principles or ethical theories. Now let's see what scholars have to say about ethical decision making. Let's see how they define the term ethical decision making. Ethical decision making is a cognitive process that considers various ethical principles, rules, consequences, and virtues, or the maintenance of relationships to guide or judge individual or group decisions or intended actions. Let's get back to Ashok's dilemma. Ashok was facing a situation that was not a routine situation. He didn't have to make a routine administrative decision. He didn't have to take a decision based on data. It was not a technical decision. He was facing a decision that questioned the following: the values and principles that were at stake. Ashok had to decide on the potential outcomes of exposing the corruption. Could lead to positive change or it might cause harm to him. Ashok had to consider his character qualities, the quality of courage, honesty, loyal to public interest. And lastly, Ashok had to consider the relationship angle also. He had to consider how the decision will affect relationship with colleagues and the public. Through this whole process of weighing the principles and the consequence, what was Ashok doing was he was considering the ethical implications of his decisions. I repeat, ethical implications of his decisions. Now, that is what ethical decision making is all about. When we make an ethical decision, you consider the ethical implications of your actions. And case studies in your exams are all about considering ethical implications. And let's move on now to understand situations that demand or tests your ethical decision-making skills. The first most challenging situation a professional faces, which tests the ethical decision-making skill, is conflict of interest. And conflict of interests are situations where personal, financial, or private interests might influence their professional judgment. Similarly, resource allocation decision also tests a civil servant or a professional administrator's ethical decision-making skill. Allocating limited resources in healthcare, education, and welfare sectors involve ethical considerations, because these decisions must balance fairness, equity, and need, ensuring that resource benefits the most deserving or needy groups. This is particularly crucial in crisis situations, such as during natural disasters or pandemics, where resources are scarce and demand is high. Another demanding situation can be a situation of responsible disobedience, which some people call it whistleblowing. When you know something illegal or a malpractice is happening in your institution, you have a proof of it. Now, these are situations which test your ethical decision-making skill. There are situations where a professional needs to ensure compliance with both legal requirement and ethical standards. And sometimes these two may clash also. Legal requirement and ethical standards may clash. For more on ethical situations that test your decision-making skills, refer to my previous video on types of ethical dilemma. Do watch that. Now that we explored the meaning of ethical decision making, we explored the situations that test your ethical decision making skill. Let's understand how to make one. What's the process for it? And speaking of process, in 2018, there was a question in UPSC exam, and the question was about this only. What's the process of resolving an ethical dilemma? The first step to resolving ethical dilemmas starts with a very simple step, and the step is called gather the facts. Do your homework. You should try to understand how the situation occurred, why this happened, what are the factors that caused it, what factors were in play, are there any historical connections, go back in time, collect data. That's how it starts. And fact gathering is the most difficult part of decision making. Why? Because this requires diligence. The next stage of making a sound ethical decision is to understand what are the ethical issues at stake. When I say ethical issues, the ethical issues can be the ethical values at stake, the value conflicts that's happening. And usually in my experience, I've seen ethical issues exist at a number of levels. It can be micro, that is at the personal level. It can be meso, that is within the department. Or it can be macro, that is organization-wide. A small case study tip, speaking of ethical issues. Now, if you see case study questions, there's always the question, what are the ethical issues involved in the above case? And remember, next time when you're doing this, when you're writing an answer for this part, remember to identify issues that exist at all the three levels. The next step in the process is identifying the stakeholders. When I say identifying the stakeholders, it means understand and identify those people who are going to be affected or the groups who will be affected by your decisions. This is a very crucial stage. Why? Because every decision you take will impact somebody else. So it's time you better understood how your decisions are going to impact the other person. Now, the most difficult part of ethical decision making, understanding the consequences. Every decision you'll make will have consequences. Knowing the consequences is a very, very important part of ethical decision making. When I say consequences, it can be immediate, it can be long term. You should be, when you're making a decision, you should try to figure out even the most minutest of the consequence. I know it's difficult. It is difficult because you cannot foresee every single consequence, but you're expected to understand most of the consequences. Let me give you a situation to test your consequence quotient. In 1950s, the drug thalidomide was prescribed by doctors in Canada, Japan, Australia to treat morning sickness among pregnant women. And the drug had severe side effects. Many babies died, many babies were born with deformities, severe side effects. When the drug was introduced, nobody could imagine the consequence like this. Later, the drug was banned. Of late, recent researchers have proved that the drug can be helpful in treating Hansen's disease, in treating wasting disease among AIDS patients and leukemia patients. Now, the larger question is, knowing the severe consequences in the past, should the drug be reintroduced? Should the drug be approved? What's your take? Share your thoughts in the comment section. The next step in making sound ethical decision is to understand your duties, understand your obligations, and the reason why those obligations are important. Now, from a civil service perspective, whenever there's an ethical dilemma, the officer needs to understand what is my official duty, what are my official obligations, and the reason why those obligations are important. And considering these obligations form an important step in ethical decision making. The next step is a step where you consider how the decision is going to impact your integrity, how the decision is going to impact your character, your reputation, your image. Just imagine, you take a decision and the very next day you land up in the newspaper's front page for wrong reasons. The next step involves a little bit of creativity. In a situation of ethical dilemma, people often, by looking at only two options, option A and option B, they put themselves into a decision corner. Don't do that next time. Look for a creative solution. Be a little innovative. Try thinking a little out of box. There'll be a third solution as well. If you look at all the 7 steps that we discussed earlier, they were very logical, consider consequences, consider duties, very analytical. But sometimes you must notice the moment you arrive at a decision, something inside you tells you that this is not right. Something inside you does not feel right. Now that's why emotional intuition also comes into play. And the last step is all about considering your emotion and intuition. At times, if your intuition red flags a certain decision, give it a second thought. It always helps. Because if you make a mistake, you cannot live with regrets and guilt. Ethical decision making is not easy. But as you keep making decisions, you learn. It's a continuous learning process. And the more decisions you make, the more clarity you have in terms of values, in terms of what principles to use. The more decisions you make, you have more clarity in terms of consequences, how to understand them. You have more clarity in terms of duties at stake. So it's a continuous learning process. I'll leave you with a thought. There are no right answers for ethical dilemmas, only imperfect solutions. Think about it. So long, happy learning.